Well, good evening, everyone. It's a real privilege to be here at this wonderful place. I am an admirer of HBU and what you're doing, and it's great to be here. And of all the topics to have, the topic of the resurrection that we're going to consider tonight. I imagine a significant number of you will be Christians and will already be convinced of the resurrection. Well, I hope that if you are, that perhaps the way we think about things tonight will help you as you formulate that to others, the amazing evidence that there is for the resurrection. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look firstly at some non-Christian accounts of the beginnings of Christianity. Now, my reason for doing this is not particularly because they're about the resurrection, although they need something like that to explain them, but because sometimes people say, well, I'm not sure I can trust the Christian accounts. The non-Christian accounts are going to be less biased. And if someone's a skeptic, they might well take that line. So we're going to look at those things. Then we're going to look at Christian accounts of the resurrection appearances and the empty tomb. Then we'll look at objections to miracles, because, by the way, the resurrection does involve a miracle, so can that be believed? And then we're going to look at the third leg of the stool, whatever that is. Now, is there too much echo for this, or is everything fine? It just sounds echoey to me, but that's fine. If it doesn't to you, then that's great. Let's begin with what non-Christians said about the origins of Christianity. And I want to begin with a non-Christian writer called Tacitus. Tacitus was born around the year 56, and he writes about the Great Fire in Rome, which took place in the year 64. The Great Fire is thought to be caused by Nero, and that made him unpopular, of course, because starting fires doesn't tend to make you popular, although he didn't have to face an election, but he still wanted to make himself more popular. And so he decided to blame the Christians. And so here we have Tacitus kicking in with his account of what happened. Now, Tacitus actually lived in Rome, so he lived in the city where these things took place. Okay, he may have been only around 8 at the time, but he, as a historian, is someone people are prepared to trust for information which takes place 40 years or more before his birth. So, in fact, we've got no reason to doubt the broad outline of this account, even if we disagree with his perspective. So this is what he says. But neither help by humans, nor generous gifts from the emperor, nor all the ways of placating heaven could stifle the scandal or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order. That means order of Nero. Therefore, to scotch the rumour, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loath for their vices, whom the crowd called Christians. So firstly, we know that there is a group of people called Christians. That's not insignificant because Christians presupposes the name Christ. Christ is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word Messiah. So if any people are called Christians, they must be a group who believe that the Jewish Messiah has come. So already we know something about this group. Then he continues, and he says, Christ, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital, that's Rome itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and become fashionable. Well, that's not a great way of talking about your own town, but there we are. But we have some confirmation here. Firstly, of course, the name Christ, or in Latin, Christus, and that he was put to death in the reign of Tiberius, which is from the year 14 through to the year 37, and that happened under the governorship of Pontius Pilate, who was governor of Judea from 26 to the year 36. So in fact, we narrowed down the events of the death of Jesus to a particular chronological period based on this and what we know of Roman history. He also confirms what we have in the New Testament, that this began in Judea. Then he continues. First then, confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for hatred of the human race. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses and when daylight failed were burned to serve as lamps by night. So we see that it was pretty tough being a Christian back then. And we also see that within 35 years of the death of Jesus, Christianity had spread so far and so fast that there were vast numbers of Christians in Rome at the time. So that's what we learn from Tacitus. Let's go on to another writer. So he gives us the spread of Christianity from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. Let's go now on to Pliny. Now Pliny, writing slightly later, he became governor of a bit of northwest Turkey called Bithynia around the year 111 or 112. And he writes to the emperor a rather creepy letter, obsequious, asking the emperor for advice on how to deal with Christians. And this is what he says about people he's dealt with as Christians. I interrogated them as to whether they were Christians. If they confessed, I interrogated them a second and a third time, threatening punishment. If they persisted, I ordered them to be led off, which means led off to execution. As for those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words given by me and prayed with incense and wine offerings to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought for this very purpose, along with the images of the gods, and also cursed Christ, which it said that no true Christian can ever be compelled to do, I thought they should be discharged. Well, you can see what a nice guy he is. I mean, really kind. If they persist as Christians, you kill them, but if they recant, you let them off. How kind. And he's got various tests to see whether people are Christians. He's going to make them worship statues of the emperor, do certain sacrifices, use words which he has given. And then this wonderful phrase, it says, and curse Christ, which it is said that no true Christian can ever be compelled to do. Fascinating, isn't it? That within 80 years of the beginnings of Christianity, a governor of an area writing to the emperor is able to distinguish between a true Christian and a Christian in name only. An interesting thing that's going on there. So you see how difficult it was to be a Christian. Of course, we know that the word Christian occurs thrice in the New Testament. And on those three occasions, it is always outsider language applying it to insiders. It's not that the Christians at first called themselves Christians. Interestingly, that New Testament phenomenon fits exactly with the two accounts we've seen, that the Christians are called Christians by outsiders. And then he goes on. He says, others named in a particular document said that they were Christians, but later denied it, saying that they had been, but they'd ceased 3 years ago, or many years ago, or even as much as 20. So he's going to go on to describe what goes on in a Christian meeting, as described by people who had renounced the Christian faith. 3 years ago, many years ago, or even 20 years ago. Well, 20 off 111, at least in England, is going to give 91. I think it's probably the same here. In other words, what we have in what follows is a description of what went on in a first century Christian meeting. And this is what goes on. They said that this had been the full extent of their guilt or error. They'd been accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and to sing antiphonally, that's one side to another, a song to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by an oath, not to some crime, but rather not to commit theft, robbery, or adultery, not to break their trust, and not to refuse to return a pledge when asked to do so. Not exactly bad stuff. But notice this. What is the logic of Christian belief implied by this account? In the Dan Brown version, and in lots of other versions similar, they like to say that something like this happened. At first, Jesus was thought to be a special person, then very special person, then a very, very, very special person. Eventually, halfway to God, 3/4 of the way to God, and after many, many years, God. The problem is this. What we saw, the reason why Christians were not able to worship the gods, the Roman gods, is because they could only worship one God. That's the logic of the passage. So what we see is something that confirms or goes with the fact that we know that Christianity began in the cradle of Judaism. Well, how many gods do Jews believe in? They believe in one. That means that they don't worship other gods. So Christianity fits exactly with that. And what are they doing in their meetings? They're singing to Christ as to a god. Now, there's no word "a" in Latin, so it could equally be as to God. They're worshipping Christ. So the only way they can worship Christ is not because they believe that he's halfway to God, but because they believe he is God himself. So there's a simple mathematical thing we need to talk about. How many gods do the Greeks have? How many gods do the Romans have? We don't know, because you could have a new god anytime. You see, if a god looks down from the sky and sees a pretty girl and wants to get together with her, and they produces another half god. So the number's going up, you see. Whereas for Jews, there is only one God, which means you can never have 1.5 gods. It's just not allowed mathematically. So what that means is there is no route whereby over a long period of time you can go from having 1.25 gods to 1.5 gods and then back down to 1 again. It just doesn't make sense. So in other words, if people are worshipping Christ, it's because they have identified him as God that early on. Pliny then continues. Many people of every age, every rank and of both sexes are being and will be called to trial. Nor is it only the cities that are affected, but the disease of this superstition is also reaching villages and farmsteads, ranches. It seems possible to check and correct this. It's pretty well agreed that the temples, which had almost become deserted, have now begun to be frequented again, and all the sacred rites, which have been neglected for a long time, are recommencing, and the flesh for sacrificial rites is being sold, for which up to now it was hard to find a purchaser. Now think about this. We have the governor of northwest Turkey writing to the emperor of Rome about 80 years after the beginnings of Christianity, saying that so many people in his area had become Christians, and it wasn't even an area evangelized by Paul. So many people had become Christians that the temples had almost become deserted. Now, of course, he could be trying to shed a bad light on his predecessor. We could try and read this cynically, but taken at face value, it really does suggest that Christianity spread very far and very fast, which is exactly what Tacitus tells us. One more account to go alongside those two as we look at the geographical spread of Christianity, and that is something rather up close. I've given you two non-Christian Gentile accounts of early Christianity. Now for something we learn from a Jewish writer, Josephus, born around the year 37, writing about what happens in his hometown when he is 25. Now, by the way, when you're reading ancient history, you don't often get something as good as that. Someone writing about what happens in their hometown when they are an adult. And here he talks about a power vacuum when the governor was away. There was no governor. The high priest seized power, and it says the high priest Ananus assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had made an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he handed them over to be stoned. There is another passage in which Josephus talks about Jesus, but it's in fact, or Christ, but it's debated. So I'm not going to talk about that passage. This is not debated in that way. And what we have here is the striking thing that people a long way away were becoming Christians, but also people very close at hand. People, for instance, who are family members were becoming followers of Jesus. James, according to the New Testament, was one of the leaders of the early church. Well, try convincing your brother that you're the Son of God and should be worshipped. Quite difficult on the whole. They tend to know you. Even a younger brother, and I'm a younger brother, you may be able to tell from the way I speak, but even a younger brother knows where his older siblings were born, because it's been talked about in the family for such a long time, since a very early stage. So a younger brother like James would of course know where older brother Jesus was born. So this idea that someone could have written the New Testament accounts of Jesus being born in Bethlehem just to fit with the passage of Micah, where it talks about a future ruler being born in Bethlehem, has some problems. The problem is, if someone made that story up, when did they make it up? You see, if they make it up before AD 62, you have family members who are around who can refute it, and these family members are prepared to die for their commitment to Jesus. On the other hand, after 62, Christianity has spread so far and so fast, it'll be very hard to start making major innovations to the message. Now, I just bring to you those three accounts of early Christianity, and the broad picture they show fits exactly with what we read about in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Acts. Christianity, according to the book of Acts, spread far and fast. It was difficult to be a Christian. They were often persecuted, and so on. It fits very closely. And I just say that as a bit of background for taking the Christian accounts seriously. I now want us to move on to look at the Christian accounts that we have for the beginnings of Christianity, and particularly the resurrection appearances and empty tomb. Of course, there are 27 witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament. Every book, even if it's one of those letters of John that doesn't mention the resurrection, presupposes that Jesus is alive. Some of them talk in more detail, but any one of those can be used to some extent as witness. People naturally go to the Gospels, the four accounts of Jesus' life, as the first port of call for evidence of the resurrection. But I want us to look at some other evidence, which is simply some of Paul's letters. Very strikingly, some of Paul's letters are agreed, even by skeptical scholars, to be from his lifetime and to be early. So something like 1 Corinthians, it's not really debated. It's by Paul around the year 55, let's say. Writing to a church in Greece, this is what Paul says. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in line with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in line with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, and he continues like that. 500 people seeing Jesus, most of whom are still alive at the time of writing. And it's almost as if he dares you to go and find them and find whether he's saying what's true. Of course, it would be a very risky strategy if those people did not exist. But it's not just that particular passage. That passage, striking, of course, that it says, I delivered that to you. That was back when Paul first went to Corinth, and it was something that he received, and of course, he received it when he was first converted. So in fact, Paul is saying this is not something that was made up in the 50s, it's not something that was made up in the 40s, it was in fact in the 30s when I became a Christian. Paul is so convinced of the resurrection, it's so central to what he says, it forms a linchpin in many of his arguments, the book of Romans, for instance. The opening of Galatians begins like this. Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. The resurrection is not something peripheral. It's something Christians have believed from the beginning. So let's look now at the four Gospels and see what we can say about them. The first thing to say is, of course, when we look at the four Gospels, that the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have some sort of relationship in their wording which is closer than the relationship they have with John. There are some things like the feeding of the 5,000 which are in all four Gospels. There are things like the triumphal entry, the Passion, and so on, which you can find in all four Gospels. But what we can say is there are commonalities, particularly between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Does that mean that we should somehow discount them, that they could result from conspiracy? Not at all, because the pattern of commonality isn't the sort that you would get from conspiracy. You have Matthew that has some things only in Matthew, Luke that has some things only in Luke. And there is an intertwining of their relationship that makes it hard for you to come up with any theory that says one of the authors simply copied from the other ones and made up the rest. But also when we look at the Gospels, there are some problems. When we look at the accounts of the resurrection, there are some differences in the way that they tell their accounts. Often people will be struck first at whether there were two angels or beings dressed in white or one. There are two in Luke and in John and one in Matthew and in Mark. And some people find that very striking. But we could look at the question then of the exact timing of what happened that Easter morning. Did Peter and John go to the tomb before or after a woman first saw an angel? Did a woman report the resurrection to Peter and John before they went? What exactly did the angel say to the women? What did Jesus first say to the women? And does Mary first learn of the resurrection from Jesus or from the angels? These are significant differences. Now, I believe that these accounts are able to fit alongside each other and all be true. But what we can say is there's a certain embarrassment to the fact that there are some striking differences between them. And this is what one New Testament scholar says about these accounts. If you imagine them being made up later, it's hard to explain. The later we imagine them, the accounts being written up, let alone edited, the more likely it would be that inconsistencies would be ironed out. So I'd like to suggest that those sort of differences that we have between the Gospels are actually a sign of those accounts not coming from a later stage. So I want to take it that the resurrection accounts are to some degree independent of each other. And there are also some significant signs of authenticity to the accounts. But let's start with our first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and look at their relationship with each other. One of the striking things that is not often commented on is the fact that if you look at the bits of Matthew, Mark, and Luke that are in speech marks, obviously we know speech marks have only been in English Bibles for about 100 years, but it gives us something to go by. If you look at the bits that are in speech marks, there is far more agreement between those three Gospels than there is at the bits outside speech marks. Well, that's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? It doesn't just apply to the things that Jesus said, it also applies to things that John the Baptist said. Now, some people try to explain this by saying that there was some common source of Matthew and Luke that they give the scholarly abbreviation of Q to. It's nice, short, so scholars can remember that sort of abbreviation. But does that explain it? Well, I'm not going to say anything against that theory, but I would simply say that it also applies the observation that wording is similar to bits that the two of those Gospels, Matthew and Luke, have in common with Mark. So you take something like the healing of that man who was not in Matthew's account, but in Mark's and Luke's, lowered down through the roof, and Jesus forgave him his sins and then told him to rise and walk. What we find as we read that account, and you can see some of the details on the slide, is that when we're in the narrative section, there's a certain level of agreement between the accounts. But of course, when you're writing, describing the same thing, you as an author have all sorts of freedom as to how you would write and describe it. But when we come on to the words of Jesus and so on, suddenly the accounts become closer. Well, that isn't explained very well by saying, oh, they had a common source. Because if you're just copying things out, why would you suddenly change your level of closeness that you follow the thing that you're copying from when you come to words? It's in fact something that follows throughout all of the Gospels, and, this is the striking thing, is true of the resurrection accounts as well. That they differ significantly in their wording, but they agree to a higher extent when we come to speech. So when we look at the way that Matthew and Mark and Luke relate to each other, we find that actually they don't have very much wording in common at all. Less in common, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, than they do in other parts of the Gospel. So that suggests to me that the accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not dependent on each other in the same way. And precisely those words, the few words that they have in common, more often are the words that are in speech. And you can go and check some of these things at home. Let's look at some particular ways which the Gospels agree. We could take Matthew and John. Now, Matthew's and John's accounts of the resurrection are really significantly different, and you can just read that and see how that is. And yet what we find is even when they report speech, there are some things in common. In Matthew, Jesus met the women, and he greets them with the normal greeting of rejoice. They came, and it says, took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, don't be afraid, go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. John's account is rather different. You just picture Mary Magdalene being there, and Jesus says to her, "Do not cling on to me." Well, that's an interesting thing because it's rather similar to Matthew's "they held on to his feet." You see, it involves touch, but it's coming at the story from a completely different angle. "For I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God." Now, the striking thing here is nowhere, not nowhere, very rarely in the Gospels does Jesus refer to his disciples as brothers. Of course, there's that incident where his actual physical family are outside and, they're calling for you, people say, and Jesus looks around at those who are around him and says, "Those who do the will of my Father, they are my brother, sister, and mother." So he does use that language, but strikingly it comes in. Two very different sets of wording, and then bang, "my brothers," there in both of them. What's more, in John, it's not just that you have the phrase "my brothers," but you also have lots of family language of common fathership. In other words, what I imagine going on here is that we have Jesus saying a greater amount of speech, and that two different witnesses have preceded what he said, and of course they've selected from that larger group of what he said and written up that a shorter amount with a certain set of details in common. That seems to me a good way of explaining the data. It's harder to say, well, one person was copying another person and they decided to make all of the details conflict, but they decided to take out a particular phrase from their source. I mean, that doesn't really make sense. So I want to maintain that we've got independence in these accounts, and yet the sort of agreement we would expect if there really is an underlying reality. What if the four accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the accounts of four different women? According to, if you just add up the numbers of women mentioned in the accounts, at least 6 are implied at any one time. And when you look at how many angels they saw and what angle it was, well, do you think 6 women piled into the tomb at once? None of them stood outside? There are many ways of fitting the accounts together if you allow them to be independent witnesses. What's more, when we look at the resurrection accounts, there are some things that would be pretty unlikely to invent. For instance, a resurrection. Now, what I mean by this, again, to appeal to N.T. Wright, who did a very thorough study of this, Christianity was born into a world where its central claim was known, and you could put that in inverted commas if you like, known to be false. Many believed that the dead were non-existent. Outside Judaism, nobody believed in a resurrection. So, in other words, it's not a very good belief to go out convincing Gentiles of, because if they hold on to any sort of Platonic view, they're going to think that the body essentially is bad, and you want to escape from that into a spiritual or intellectual realm after you die. Jews believed in a resurrection that was for all people, or maybe all of God's people at the end of time, not for one out of sequence with the others. By the way, that's why gospel after gospel tells you that when the disciples saw Jesus, they thought, "Ooh, it must be a ghost," or something like that. Why? Because their category, even if you have a lookalike Jesus in front of you, is not to say, "Oh, that means Jesus has been raised from the dead." The way they would naturally interpret that is, "Oh, an angel just like Jesus has been sent." Another thing about the resurrection, we can say, is that a striking thing you have is that the women are witnesses. This is well known, but as Josephus says, not one of his finest moments, "Let not the witness of women be accepted because of the lightheadedness and insolence of their kind." Well, those are his words. But the point is, it displays an attitude which would have meant that a woman's witness would not be the best sort of thing to make up in your account. Then, across the four accounts of the resurrection, we have again a feature, and I'm trying to point out the way we have commonality in the four accounts and difference at the same time, but the pattern of commonality and difference is striking, because what we have is bright angels. Whenever angels or men are described, it's in white, something about their dazzling clothes, and so on. Jesus is not so described, and yet he is a central figure. So when we look at the accounts that we have, white as snow, white robe, dazzling clothes, angels in white, all 4 accounts have that. And yet when they come to Jesus, there's nothing of that sort. Then, when we look at the accounts, this is a really bizarre thing you'd make up. Why would anyone do this? We have doubt. 4 verses before the climactic end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus is appearing to disciples, and it says, when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. I mean, how anticlimactic can you get? How could someone doubt when they're actually seeing Jesus? Well, the way you doubt is this. You interpret that Jesus as an angel, not the actual resurrection. Luke says these words, reports of Jesus' resurrection, appeared to the men as nonsense. They didn't believe them. He said to them later on, "Why are you troubled?" This is when he appears in the room to them. "And why do doubts arise in your hearts?" At the very moment Jesus appears to them, they are doubting. And he continues, "While they still disbelieve for joy." Or, of course, in John's Gospel, the story of doubting Thomas. Now, there are debates about the ending of Mark's Gospel, but of course, in that longer ending, again, you have the theme of unbelief. Wouldn't believe it, didn't believe it, rebuke for unbelief. So what we're finding is the repeated theme of that's hard to believe. So why? It's not that people were gullible back then, that it was easy to believe in a resurrection, quite to the contrary. Well, could the accounts arise from conspiracy? Well, there are 2 ways that we can come at this argument. Firstly, we can say it's difficult to explain both the empty tomb and sincere belief in resurrection appearances. That is, it seems that there are many reports of people saying, "I have seen Jesus risen from the dead." By saying that you can find some tomb of grave robbers which for some reason wants to steal a body which is of no financial worth at all, or some conspiring disciples who might get rid of the body, does not explain why some other people might claim to have seen him risen from the dead. It doesn't explain why 500 people might have seen him risen from the dead. So what you would need to explain the data is a very large-scale literary conspiracy where you try and make the whole of the New Testament to have been some result of some craze in writing which people got and published different books in different places in order to make up some impression of Jesus being risen from the dead. And of course, that's very difficult to do. What's more, if there was a conspiracy, you don't have very long to plan it. You see, if you want to make sure you've got an alive Jesus on Sunday morning, the best thing to do is make sure he doesn't get arrested on Thursday night. See? So, really, if you're going to plan a resurrection, you don't have very long, and not very long to make a great message out of it either. What about sincere delusion? Could we have people, we know that all sorts of people have religious experiences and sometimes they're not grounded in reality. Well, that doesn't explain the empty tomb, where the body went. What about group hallucination? Well, imagine a number of people sitting around in a group having hallucinogenic drugs, and they all hallucinate. Do they all hallucinate the same thing? Group hallucination doesn't exist. So the idea that a whole group are going to see the same thing just won't work. The natural explanation, as I said, is that if you see something, you are seeing an angel, not that you are seeing a resurrection. So the best explanation is that what we're dealing with is independent eyewitnesses, and that these women, not all in a single group, not all at the tomb at the same time, have given their information to the different gospel writers. Consider the variety that we have of gospel accounts. We have Jesus appearing to people in the morning, in the evening, inside, outside, in the town, in the country, in Galilee and Judea, up a hill, by a lake, in 1s, 2s, and 500s, and some numbers in between. Women and men standing, sitting, walking, eating with people. You have interactions where you go back and forth, one saying, then they respond, then another saying, and so on. It's not that there was some distant flicker where you thought you might have seen something in the twilight. No, Jesus is far, some appearances, and close. And he talks to people. Every single occurrence of seeing Jesus, you have Jesus talking, and he's always there with adults. It's not mention of children. In other words, the sort of thing we're talking about is so big, so real, it's hard to say that there's any form of hallucination involved. So then you need to, if you're going to have all of these resurrection appearances made up, you need an absolutely huge conspiracy, a huge amount of dishonesty that just doesn't make sense when you read the historical records. So the combined effect of having the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances, I think, is a really significant argument on its own for Jesus having been risen from the dead, having been raised from the dead. We then come to an objection, or a group of objections that's commonly made. And it goes like this. Yes, we see the point that you're making about the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances. However, miracles are themselves more difficult to believe. As David Hume, the philosopher, said, when he wrote about miracles, he said that we don't experience miracles, and that our belief in anything should be proportionate to the regularity of an experience. So how can we have a great belief in a sort of one-off experience? And then he says, well, how can you take people's word for it? The evidence resulting from the testimony of humans admits of a diminution. That means you trust it less, greater or less, in proportion as the fact is more or less unusual. And so he thinks that if something's very unusual, it's much harder to believe. Or as he says another time, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And as a firm, an unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Or, again, no miracle in history is publicly attested by a sufficient number of sensible and educated people of integrity as to have sufficient probability. So, there's no use just having one or two people. They could be dodgy people. Humans are gullible, and generally, more miracles are claimed where people are less educated. And he says, and if one religion has a miracle in its favor, what about all the other religions? Don't they sort of count as counter-testimony to the miracle of the one religion? The way people might put it nowadays would be a bit like this. Isn't anything more likely than a miracle? I mean, isn't it far easier to believe in a conspiracy than a miracle? Because miracles just don't occur in our experience. Or as Carl Sagan famously said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And one hears that rather often, rather too frequently, in fact. Or someone might say, but if I allow that miracles happen in the universe, the problem is that undermines science. If goblins can get into your test tube, then it rather messes things up. Belief in miracles is fundamentally anti-science. What's more, there's a great elegance to natural laws and to physical laws. It gives you a nice organizing principle for all knowledge, and you're telling me that at some stage a genie or a god or whatever it is, the flying spaghetti monster, gets in and changes things. That seems to me unelegant. Unparsimonious? How can we explain that? Well, I just want to respond very briefly. Firstly, your antecedent, your prior beliefs affect your judgment of what is probable and also of what is extraordinary. For instance, if we presuppose that there is no God and that we're just in a naturalistic universe, then we could see very well why someone might believe that anything would be more probable than a miracle. It makes a certain amount of sense. But who established in the first place that we are in that naturalistic universe? That's a presupposition that people might bring to a judgment. And so carrying that belief that there is no God, then coming to the evidence, they read the evidence in that light. But let's say a given prior belief that there is a God, or that the God of the Hebrews is the true God. Would that affect things? Well, actually, if the God of the Hebrews is the true God, that rather affects the belief. And when you're or the judgment of whether something's probable or not, or extraordinary. Extraordinary is a very slippy word. Of course, belief in the Bible is that God does extraordinary things, but not that they are extraordinary for him. Not that they are something which is not a part of the pattern of what we would see in this universe. What's more, Hume basically says, I'm not going to believe a miracle unless you coerce me to believe, unless there is an evidence of such weight that I would have no choice but to believe. So he says, well, I might believe in miracles if there was some unexplained darkness over the whole world for 8 days and no one could come up with it. So the reason why? So what he's saying is if there was an unexplained darkness over the whole world for 7 days, he wouldn't believe. I mean, what sort of system is that? Of course, what he's saying is ultimately unfalsifiable. He says nothing would ever be sufficient in evidence. What's more, I'd like to say that miracles are not a disturbance of order, but in fact a sign of order, and that's something I'm going to come on to establish. Given the right background beliefs, the evidence is quite adequate to believe in the resurrection, even if it's not coercive or compelling in the sense that someone can still have a choice of rejecting it. But I want to come on to this mysterious third leg of the stool, or third line of argument that I want to use for the resurrection. And it's quite simply this, and it's in fact a bag of arguments. It's basically this: everything else about Jesus. Now, I'm not going to give you a lecture on everything else about Jesus, because as John says at the end of his Gospels, not even the world would have space for all the books that could be written. But you see, I established, I think, at the beginning, that if you have an empty tomb and all of those resurrection appearances, that on its own would be pretty striking evidence that something rather remarkable might have gone on. The sort of evidence you'd need to establish a resurrection. But there's a further element to it. That is that those things didn't just occur to any old person, they actually occurred to someone about whom other things can be established. So I'm not saying that Jesus did appear as part of my argument. My argument is this, that many people had belief that Jesus appeared, which is very hard to explain other than by positing that he did appear. Do you see? That's the difference. I'm not trying to prove a miracle as if I can do that within a scientific way. But what we have to say is the resurrection appearances and the empty tomb aren't just things about any old person, they're about a particular person. So what if a resurrection happened, or that sort of evidence happened to someone who had already, as established independently by testimony, become famous for miracles? Whether or not Jesus performed miracles, there is no doubt that more miracles are reported about Jesus in earlier sources than about anyone else from that time period. There's no rabbi who's said to have performed as many miracles. What's more, we can say, it seems historically probable, even if I were a skeptic, that Jesus already believed himself to be the promised Messiah. That sort of thing seems to be best explained the sort of things we were hearing about even yesterday on Palm Sunday, where he took a donkey and rode into Jerusalem. What's more, the resurrection appearances and the disappearance of the body concern someone whose life, on other grounds, could plausibly bring to completion many Old Testament themes. The theme of how sin would be dealt with, the theme of how God can speak to us, and so many patterns to do with the fulfillment of prophecy. He seems, historically, to have been from the tribe of Judah. There are early claims that he was in fact of the line of David, and early claims that he was born in Bethlehem. Now you could say those were all made up afterwards, but I'm wanting to say there is a level of independence about the evidence for those claims. What's more, again we can establish independently that Jesus did some rather remarkable teaching, or at least that some very remarkable teaching is attributed to him. So if we take Confucius, and I managed to find the Chinese, not that I can read Chinese, but in case someone can, for his saying, you know the golden rule that Jesus has? Well, this is what Confucius says: what you do not want yourself, do not force on others. Or as a Jewish rabbi, Hillel, says, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow, that is the whole law. Now you can see that that is what one might call a negative golden rule. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. Jesus, however, is the first person to whom is attributed the positive golden rule. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, someone might say, but how do we know Jesus actually said that? Well, Whether or not he said it, there are a couple of possibilities. One is he said it, and the other is he had a great genius disciple. So either way, something rather remarkable, independent of the resurrection, is connected with Jesus. I mean, maybe he was an amazing person. Maybe he just happened to have a lot of amazing disciples who could come up with things like the golden rule in its positive form or the parable of the prodigal son. But either way, something rather remarkable is connected to Jesus. I want to come to something completely independent of all those line of arguments as a final coincidence we find about Jesus. More could be said, but I want to look at this. When did Jesus die? Well, we established earlier that he died between AD 26 and 36. That comes from Tacitus. He also clearly died on a Friday, as is established by the long early tradition of the early Christians. And from the gospel accounts, we know that he died around the time of Passover, which would be 14th or 15th of Nisan. If the Passover started on the 15th of Nisan, then the meal we would have for the Passover would have been, if Passover started on the 14th of Nisan, then one could read the Matthew, Mark, and Luke as saying Jesus was born, died on the 15th, after they'd just had the Passover meal the night before, the Last Supper. On the other hand, one could read John as saying that the Passover had not yet taken place, and that might lead you to think that he was crucified on the 14th of Nisan. Well, I think there are ways, in fact there are many ways, of fitting those accounts together. But all I want to establish now is that Jesus was crucified either the 14th or 15th of Nisan. And it's not just Christian sources that say that. In fact, the Talmud, the great collection of Jewish traditions, says on the eve of the Passover, they hung Jesus the Nazarene. So in other words, we have it both from Jewish and Christian sources. There's no reason to doubt it, even from a skeptical point of view. What we can say is also days are these rather sort of fixed things. Now, you know that Jews were rather concerned about the keeping of the Sabbath. It's something that we can document very clearly for this time. And we know from various people who have holy days that they are very important to them. Recently, when the dateline of Samoa changed side of the international dateline, that caused some tension amongst various Seventh-day Adventists about which day they would actually keep as the Sabbath. Should it be the Saturday or should it be the Sunday? And in fact, the majority view was that they should follow and keep the Sunday in accordance with earlier practice of counting in sequences of 7. But obviously that caused a great tension, as you can imagine. So it's very difficult to imagine that someone would change the holy day of the Jews from a Saturday, in some sense, to a Sunday, change the most special day without something rather remarkable going on. So these sorts of days about the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday are things that we can be pretty certain of. Then we look at a book that came out by a friend of mine in Cambridge, Professor Colin Humphreys, Professor of Material Science there, who has written on the mystery of the Last Supper, building on some earlier scientific work which he and an astronomer had done. And he says we can establish these things about the death of Jesus. It took place on a Friday, Passover time, 14th or 15th Nisan, AD 26 to 36. Now, the point about this is that the Jews counted their months by looking at the first appearance of the new moon. So you can work out when the moon was, and you can work out when it appeared, and you can work out when the months were. And there are really only two dates which will fit for the crucifixion of Jesus. One is the year 30, one is the year 33, to have them on a Friday. Of those two dates, the year 33 is far preferable. Why? Well, according to Luke, John the Baptist began his ministry in the year 29. And he continues, and then Jesus has a significant ministry after John the Baptist has been arrested. According to John, you need to have a ministry of Jesus of a minimum of 3 years. The way Pilate behaves in the Gospels as someone very much weak, not able to stand up to the Jews and say, I'm not going to do what you want, fits very well with the way his position was substantially weakened after AD 31 because of certain goings on at Rome, which I can explain. So it seems most likely that the crucifixion took place on the 3rd of April, AD 33. That's the sort of thing that's established from a number of historical accounts as well as from astronomy. Now, when we look at what might have gone on at that time, we're rather struck by the way that the Gospel of Mark tells us that from the 6th hour there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. One separate account by a non-Christian, recorded by a Christian, but recorded in the sort of way that seems to be reliable, tells us that Thales writes about this darkness, explaining it as an eclipse of the sun in the 3rd book of his histories. Without reason, it seems to me, says Julius Africanus, because, of course, you can't have an eclipse at full moon. However, Peter, when he talks to the crowd at Pentecost, says this in his sermon: "The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the day of the Lord comes," quoting there from the prophecy of Joel. Now, what's so striking is this, that it's been calculated and only known since 1983 that between 6:20 and 7:11 p.m. on the 3rd of April, AD 33, there was a lunar eclipse which was visible from Jerusalem. Crowds waiting to begin their Passover meal, watching for the sunset, watching for the moon, would have seen this. And that has only been known since 1983. So what we find is when we look at the person of Jesus, some rather remarkable things come together. Because what happens at a lunar eclipse is the moon turns red, turns blood color, if you like. What we find is a number of things coming together. We have the empty tomb. We have the amazing resurrection appearances, but we also have the fact that so many other things are associated with the person of Jesus. The early belief that he was God. The amazing teaching attributed to him in the parables or in the Golden Rule. The way he seems most probably to have been born in Bethlehem. Now, I'm not saying any one of those points I could prove. People can pick them off one at a time. But each time what you're having to do is read the evidence either slightly or rather a lot against the grain. Most naturally, you'd say, yes, those things happened. And so what we find is, whether it's that, about the moral teaching, or about a lunar eclipse, we have so many different things coming together saying that this person is remarkable. And what that means is when I say there is evidence of the resurrection, I'm not saying there was some unelegant disturbance of physical laws, something that broke in and messed physics up. Not at all. What I'm saying is actually Jesus himself is the organizing principle. Jesus himself is the pattern. If you observe again and again about Jesus, you will see remarkable things clustering about him. And it's those remarkable things clustering about him combined with the resurrection appearances and the empty tomb that together makes such a compelling case for us to say that really he should be the organizing principle for all knowledge. As it says at the beginnings of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the Word in fact is Jesus who became flesh. He is the one who communicates who God is to us. And I want to say that I think God has spoken to us in Jesus so clearly that there really is no excuse to anyone who has looked into it. The evidence is very clear, but of course, if you don't want to believe, you can always find a way round. Thank you.